elsewhere in the United States and in Europe to this panel discussion on Black Lives Matters in Europe too. I'm Hilary Silver. I'm a professor of sociology, international affairs, and public policy at George Washington University. And this event is sponsored by the George Washington University Seminar on Europe since COVID-19. It's this idea that we should follow what's happening in Europe since the onset of the pandemic, because there will be major changes that take place as a consequence of this crisis. I'd like to thank my co-organizers, Hope Harrison and Catherine Kleppinger, the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and its director, Marlene Laruelle, and administrator, Matt Cooley, and the Elliott School of International Affairs for its support. The format for our event will be, after just this brief introduction, is to hear individual presentations from each panelist, which will be followed by a roundtable discussion among them to compare experiences in different countries, and that will be followed by question and answers. If you have questions, just post them either in the Q&A or in the chat. The webinar is being recorded, and after an hour and a half, we're going to turn off the recording, but the students are invited to stay online to chat informally with our participants. Well, everyone's invited to stay on informally. So let me just try to set the context for today's event. The killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th, 2020, sparked protests against police brutality and profiling in at least 140 cities in the United States, and soon this spread to the world. This wave of mostly peaceful, multiracial uprisings was fueled by additional cases of police violence against Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and Ahmaud Arbery in Brunswick, Georgia, and an increasingly long list of names that were recited in a ritual manner at demonstrations across the country. And all of this took place during the worst pandemic in a century. Now, this wave of protest was hardly the first. It was inspired, of course, by the nonviolent civil rights movement of the 60s, but the establishment of the Black Lives Matters movement is usually traced to several Black women who used the Twitter hashtag of Black Lives Matters in an outrage response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman, who shot to death an African-American teenager, Trayvon Martin, in 2012. This injustice was then followed by a 2014 murder of Michael Brown, who was an 18-year-old Black man, by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and that sparked more civil disorders. And so slowly the slogan, "No justice, no peace," which was a local slogan, began to resonate around the world. And a lot of European countries have their own histories of police violence and harassment against non-white young men. The solidarity marches with Black Lives Matters in June of this year in many European cities weren't just imitations or imports or offshoots of the American unrest that followed the George Floyd murder. There have long been racial tensions in the UK, like riots in Brixton and Bradford and elsewhere, that have been key to local politics and social science in that country. Now, the Anglo-Saxon world framed these conflicts in explicitly racial terms, but on the continent, there has been, at least until the 2000 Racial Equality Directive, a reluctance to use this terminology. The long shadow of European fascism and the Holocaust put brakes on the state collection of racial statistics, while concentrating on questions of migration or Islamic extremism, which cloaked the colonial legacies from view. Now, some leftist politicians subsumed race relations under social class interests. The right insists on an assimilationist nationalism that would durably exclude minorities as second-class citizens. So this leaves little room in Europe, politically speaking, to frame the grievances of non-white minorities in racialized terms that would reflect their actual experiences and increasingly their identities as Black. This gives rise to what we now see as Black European studies, as well as anti-racist activism on the local, national, and European scales. So, for example, France's SOS Racisme movement and the 2005 waves of violence, the rodeos in the banlieue, have long preceded the murder of 21-year-old Adama Traoré, who was asphyxiated by a French policeman, who was then acquitted, and then the recent Justice for Adama protests. And it's this history that simply converged with that of George Floyd. And we can point to similar instances in Germany, the Netherlands, and even the Nordic countries. They have produced a European-wide anti-racist network. They have pressured the European Union to devise a newly proposed EU anti-racism action plan for 2020 to 2025. Our panelists are going to be discussing these events, both in their own countries and Europe-wide. They're going to discuss how American Black Lives Matters and the George Floyd protest influenced the anti-racist efforts in each of their countries, how their respective national histories differ from that of the American, how their countries avoid or collect official statistics on race or use religion or ethnicity or nationality instead to monitor group inequalities. They will they'll discuss how movements in their countries for Black lives or migrant rights, for the Roma, against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism work together politically or have separate sets of interests, and whether their discourse blurs these ideas together. We'll look at whether the EU supports or hinders the national anti-racist efforts, and how the police engage with Black communities, and whether there have been these specific incidents of police violence that spark uprisings. Finally, I hope they will address as well the June 2020 protests being affected by the COVID epidemic, and whether or not there were counter demonstrations by the far right or police violence. This panel of experts then are going to discuss race relations and activism to oppose state violence against minorities from France, Germany, and the Netherlands. And let me introduce them to you very briefly. Sinan Çankaya is assistant professor in the Department of Public Administration and Political Science at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. He is a writer and a cultural anthropologist. He earned a Ph.D. on processes of inclusion and exclusion of ethnic minority police officers and studied racial profiling. He is also, as a journalist, has published, he used to write a column in Correspondent. His main research topics are racial profiling, racialization, diversity policies, and in and exclusion within organizations. He also recently published a nonfiction book called My Innumerable Identities, and he'll be speaking first. I'm just going to go in the order of the speakers. Noah Ha is the acting scientific director at the Deutsche Zentrum für Migrations- und Integrationsforschung, or DEZIM. Did I say that right? I hope so. Previously, she taught at the Technical University in Berlin, the Humboldt University, and the Technical University in Dresden on topics like post-colonial urbanism, memory politics and public space, and critical race, migration, and integration studies. She helped found the Critical Race, Post-Colonial, and Decolonial Studies Association, and she is active in migrant and decolonial civil society organizations. She is co-editor of a really interesting book on street vending in the neoliberal city, a global perspective on the practices and policies of a marginal economy. Sarah Mazuz is a tenured researcher at the CNRS in the CERAPS laboratory. Her PhD is from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. She was a Marie Curie fellow at the Humboldt University as well in Berlin, and a postdoctoral fellowship in the ERC research program Moral, for moral anthropology. She is the author of numerous books, La République et ses autres, politique d'altérité dans la France des années 2000. She has a new book, which I highly recommend, which is just simply called Race. Ojiaku Nwabuzo is Senior Research Officer at the European Network Against Racism, where she's responsible for coordinating the ENAR's research and policy analysis. And this includes yearly shadow reports on racism in Europe. I highly recommend that you have a look at these in order to track what's going on Europe-wide. In recent years, she's been focusing on policing in the criminal justice system, and she's working on her PhD at the Vrije Universiteit, I assume that's de Bruxelles, where her doctoral research focuses on anti-racism advocacy and anti-discrimination policies in Europe. She worked previously at Runnymede, which is a race equality think tank in Europe, and she studied deaths in custody at Runnymede. So these are our very distinguished speakers, and it is my pleasure to now turn over the microphone, as we say, to Sinan, please.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Hillary, for this invitation and obviously on this very important topic. I'm going to start off straight away. So I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I've actually done research with the Amsterdam police organization, basically sitting in the back of a police car, joining police officers on beat patrol. I've done this research now almost 10 years ago. The research was published, and then it exploded. Interestingly, because of the first wave of Black Lives Matter protests in the US.
Oh.
So yes, that was very interesting to witness. I published the work. The work did lead to questions to the parliament and local municipalities. However, the research came in a completely different light after the protests, the first wave of protests in the States. So immediately off the bat, there is obviously a connection between international happenings, international politics, and also how these images travel, how they are then, and this is correct, right? So these are not just merely imported, but they are made sense of in the Dutch context. So I will just be discussing and giving you a little bit of background on the Netherlands. So this last summer we had, and I don't think that I'm exaggerating here, we had in the Netherlands historical protests against institutionalized racism, anti-Black racism, and anti-racism in general. The protests were in all the major cities, but also smaller cities. We witnessed protests in the Netherlands. I think that was also really remarkable was that the protests seemed to be carried by different parts of people in society. So you saw, you had the let's say the activists from the first hour. who have been vocal on these issues for a longer time, but particularly because of the protests against the blackface figure of Zwarte Piet, and these protests particularly ignited after 2011. So there was already an infrastructure for the past 10 years, I would say, in the Netherlands, where activists did a lot of work. And all of this coincided with what happened in the States. But it also led to very quick mobilization last summer by these activists from the first hour. But just to underline again, historical in the sense that the protests were spread all over the Netherlands, young and old, and from people from different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds. What was also interesting was that, and this is, I'm saying this somewhat ironically, but our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, from the Liberal political party, he actually said after these protests that racism is not just an American problem, but that the Netherlands also has a systemic problem with racism. Which is interesting. Thinking of the Dutch colonial history, of course, and the relationship of people with Caribbean descent and the Netherlands, which is also interesting. Thinking of, for instance, the word apartheid, which is stemming from Dutch settlers in South Africa, and this is already quite telling. Right? It's telling for the Dutch context, in which there is basically no talk on racial relations. So I'm just going to move on to that second part. In the Netherlands, and I'm relying here on the work by Gloria Wekker and her recent book, White Innocence, but also Philomena Essed. The first, there's this Dutch self-image of being tolerant, and having this also historical connection to pluralism. And this is also related to the Dutch history of pillarization, right? Wherein we had these all different religious backgrounds, they had their own pillars, and the dominant mode of cohabitation, political accommodation, was that these pillars existed next to each other, and difference was tolerated. And in a way, you saw this similar kind of approach to Dutch minorities, where minorities were tolerated. But the issue with the notion of tolerance is that the majority white group is basically keeping minorities at a distance. So it's the notion of tolerance is in and of itself clearly hierarchical. But going back to this tolerant self-image, so the first paradox is that the Dutch are post-racial or non-racial and tolerant to difference. And at the same time, there are all these clear examples of institutional racism. Next to this, and also this is related to the Dutch history again, when difference is mentioned, this is particularly in terms of culture and in terms of ethnicity. So the emphasis really is, for instance, on national identity and Western civilization. But we shouldn't mix this up with thinking that these words are devoid of any racialized connotation. They are clearly racialized. And I here refer to the work of historical anthropologist Anne Stoller, who has pointed out that biology was only one part of how race is defined, and that from the outset, race was always about cultural competences, respectable behavior, and being part of Europe. And this is particularly the case, and this is, I think, the most exemplary way of explaining this: the Dutch notion of autochthony and allochthony. So these are very, very Dutch, Flemish words to talk about difference. And they do not have clear equivalents in English. But the words really show and demonstrate that race has long been a part of a culturalized discourse in the Netherlands. So autochthony and allochthony, they refer to words that derive from geography. And autochthony refers to sediments that are connected to the soil, and allochthonous are sediments that do not belong to the soil. So here you already see that the word autochtone, autochthony, creates a majority population of people who are attached to Dutch soil. But this is clearly not a non-racial word. Because the word is also used to second and third and fourth generation minorities still, despite their connection to the Dutch soil, they are being referred to as allochtone. So this all leads to a very clear conclusion, which is to be Dutch is to be white. And the words allochtone and autochtone cannot hide the frames, the underlying frames that are operative here. So in the Netherlands, and despite the Dutch colonial history, there hasn't been an explicit race talk. When difference was discussed, mentioned, politicized, this was mainly through the lens of culture and ethnicity. And in fact, so this is really interesting to follow this process. It is only more recently with the politicization of Black Pete but also the normalization of anti-Muslim racism, that a more explicit talk on race is emerging in the Netherlands. And the Black Lives Matter protests also add to this. So yeah, I would say that these are very important shifts in the Dutch landscape when we are thinking on the words of race, ethnicity, and culture. Let me just go back to important moments in the Netherlands, also connected to these protests. So I already mentioned the activism and protests against Black Pete. I already said that 2011 was a key moment, but these protests date back to 1910. So we are not dealing with something new here. It's important to underline this. And another important moment in the recent history has been the killing of Mitch Henriquez in The Hague in 2015, a man with his origins in Aruba, a Dutch former colony, and this killing was followed also incidents in the States, and they again led to protests not only in The Hague but in the major cities in the Netherlands, and we saw after these protests, we saw activist groups organizing and mobilizing, and there are actually in the Netherlands right now quite strong anti-racist movements like Kick Out Zwarte Piet, Nederland wordt beter, Control-Alt-Delete, which is specifically targeting ethnic racial profiling and institutionalized racism by the police organization. So I would say that these developments also strengthened anti-racist movements. And yes, they are leading to backlash as well. Interestingly enough, the moment the anti-racist movement started to become stronger, the notion of polarization came into the political discourse by what I call the radical moderates, the radical center, and you see a clear mechanism of disqualifying legitimate social strife and struggle by the notion of polarization, that these groups are that they are negative in their approach, that they are undermining social cohesion in the Netherlands, that these protests, I'm not saying anything new here, right? That they are sowing more division in the Netherlands. So you see this backlash, in media, in politics. You also see that public policy and public administrators are thematizing polarization. This is becoming an issue on the agenda of local municipalities. And I think this is a development that needs to be closely looked at. Because again, as I said, because it's disqualifying, in my eyes, the legitimate social struggle. So yeah, where do we stand right now? I think that, having said that the protests were historic for the Netherlands, I am seeing also we are a few months. It's been a while now, the summer, but I'm seeing very little concrete action. So the next push, and also the claim of activists to come up with coherent national policies, anti-racist policies, government action, the Netherlands is stuck in that phase, and I would say that the approach is still somewhat between the denial of racism, the aggressive denial of racism, and almost a liberal approach to anti-racism. What do I mean by that? Anti-racism is the issue of individual responsibility, of morality, and the response according to this is not by coincidence a liberal political party, the VVD, our Prime Minister Mark Rutte. The response needs to come from civil society and citizens, and not so much the government, apparently. So I am seeing an impasse here, and that the issue is not really moving. I mean, yes, consciousness raising, yes, that is still going on. Yes, there is an opening, but at the same time, the push to concrete action is still lacking. Maybe a last point. Oh, okay. Maybe a last point. So, because again, having underlined the historical nature of these protests, I do also see mixed responses. On the one hand, as I said already, the denial of racism, but I also see division among social movements in the Netherlands, where how do I put this? Where there is a uncomfortable relation still between using these racial frameworks in the Dutch context, because also from the point of view of the different ethnic minorities in the Netherlands, this leads to unease. For instance, what do I mean? In the discourse that is now emerging, there is little attention to, for instance, anti-Muslim sentiments and concrete radicalization policies that are targeting Muslim communities in the Netherlands. But also very important in my own work is that particularly, and I'm following here what the Dutch anthropologist Anouk de Koning also has said, that the key racialized other in the Netherlands are Moroccan Dutch young men. And also the most recent cases of police violence have consistently been targeting Moroccan Dutch youngsters in the Netherlands. We have recent examples of WhatsApp groups with police officers, and the language is constantly targeting Moroccan Dutch youngsters. So this is the last point that I wanted to raise, is that there is a tension here, not just for academics, for academic work, but I also see this tension in social movements in the Netherlands, which, and I'm saying this as an activist myself, can also lead to diminished solidarity and not following the path of coalition politics. And I will end here.
Thank you. I appreciate your trying to stay within 15 minutes. We're getting close to 20 now. So, so I just want to remind the speakers that we'll try to keep within that framework. That's great. Our next speaker is Noah, right? I think that's right. Noah?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, I brought, my privilege to share. Now it's coming back. I can share my slides now. But just before getting into the presentation, I would like to thank you, Hillary, for setting up this conversation. And I think it's really interesting to have like a Dutch, French, and German perspective here together and bring that into conversation with US conversations, and so having a transatlantic conversation. Because I see a lot of similarities, which were told already about the Dutch context, but I think there are also huge differences what's going on in Germany. So let me start. I was able to bring a presentation. I wasn't sure whether I can make it, but I put together a short presentation. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, because I don't see you anymore on my here. So there are many plates on the table here. I won't be able to address all of the questions, but to start a bit, I just called it race in translation, because we have also the confusion here in Germany. What do we call by racism? Who is meant by it, and so on. And so with the next slide, I'm trying to make to recount what I see as a difference. I've brought 3 books which I think are important for understanding racism in the European context. Sinan was already referring to the work of Gloria Wecker on white innocence. In the middle, you have the book on Fatima El Tayeb, Queering Ethnicity, European Others, Queering Ethnicity in Post-National Europe. And then the other book, which is edited by Gominda Brambra, on Decolonizing the University, which is the British context, which is not really the continent, but it's also a colonial empire. And so you see in very below, I make a difference between metropolitan colonialism and settler colonialism. And I would understand the addressing of race and racialization in the European context as a form of metropolitan colonialism, because it's developed and ingrained in metropolitan societies, being at the center, and everybody else and everybody else's histories in the periphery. Where in the US you have a different context of colonialism, which is a settler colonialism also in regard to question of indigeneity, but also the history of enslavement and how Black people were brought to the US, which is interesting if you look at the European history, that 500 years ago, it was a Spanish king who allowed that the transportation of enslaved people is not crossing anymore through Europe and goes directly. And it's also very telling that the knowledge of how many people were enslaved is not part of the European memory culture. So we have very few locations where the victims of enslavement are honored, or where you have places to memorize also these grievances. So this is where I debark to understand racism in the European context. And in particular, looking at the question how Black Lives Matter in Germany, I also want to show a little bit of a history of Black life, of Black community organizing. On the right side, you see a book, Farbe bekennen, in English, I don't know. I don't get the, but the book is, but the book is,
I don't know.
It's facing your color, something like this, but it's also when you telling the truth. It's like a German saying, you
Confront
put the, yeah, you confront color. So it's a
acknowledging color.
Yeah, but it's also a saying in Germany. So it's playing around with skin color, and but also with the saying, German saying. And it's below you see it's Afro-German women on their path of their own history. And what is important, in particular in this transatlantic conversation, that conversation was enabled by Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde was in Germany. She was for a few years or for some months in Berlin. And she was meeting Afro-German women, and she was asking them, how do you define yourself? And they were like, what do you mean? And so they were coming up with, Afro-American, Afro-German, and playing around with that. And this book is from 1986. I would think it should be mandatory reading in elementary schools in Germany, because it's not just telling a history of some women, how they experience daily life. It's also digging into colonial history of Germany, because some of the women are directly connected to German colonial history. Then on the other side, you see a screenshot of organization, a Black organization. It's Initiative Schwarze Menschen in Deutschland, the initiative of Black people in Germany. And they recently had their 30th year celebration. So this is a history of at least 30 years organized Black organization. And then in the middle, it's a younger organization, EOTO, Each One Teach One. They are based in Berlin, and they very much a community-based library with a lot of community-based projects and empowering young Black pupils in school and so on. So they're very present, and it's and they have a kind of a longer history. And then I make a jump to the question how Germany is monitoring questions on race, ethnicity, and racism. Actually, not at all. There are a lot of civil society organizations who do it. This, what I brought here, is the state report of this year published by the German government, because they have signed the International Convention Against Racism, so they have to report every 2 years, I think, to the UN. And it's all in English, but actually in German. But actually what they're saying is, due to our past of National Socialism, we don't collect data on the basis of ethnicity or racialization or race-based categories. So they neglect and they are not getting up with this statistical data. So they also say they are not in the position also to make any information and collect data on racist discrimination. This is what the UN is demanding. collect data on the population, the composition of the population, but as well on racist discrimination. So there are new projects coming on in terms of equality data and gaining equality data, also community-based surveys. They're coming up. And actually, this is also an outcome of this year that the center where I'm working, which is like a federal research center, we just got the how you say, Auftrag, that we should.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so that we should set up a monitoring on race and racism. And this is a huge discussion because it's the German Center on Integration and Migration. And so we have a lot of discussions going on right now. But I think this is also connected to the time we're in. So this. Then coming back also to the question, why now and why in this year? During the pandemic, what happened? On one hand, we have seen, this is what in the middle is, that the Black Lives Matter demonstration in Germany were huge. In many cities, many people were on the street and were addressing not just that they don't like it, what happened in the US, but also making sure that what happening in the US is happening in Germany too. And it was actually the first time, and that's a bit of similar what Sinan was saying, it was the first time to address structural racism. Before we had a lot of discussion on, yeah, there is some racism, but it was very hard to address that there is racism within the institutions. This happened, but that also happened, it was the first time it was acknowledged that there is anti-Asian racism, or called corona racism. So there was a new group of people being targeted by racist violence, which were before not really understood as being victims of racism. And then what happened at the same time, that was very specific to Germany, that in March, the government came up to put up a cabinet committee to enforce the fight against right extremism and racism. Because what happened in February, there was an attack in Hanau. 9 people were killed by a right extreme terrorist in 2 different shisha bars. Then in October, we had in Halle an attack on a synagogue on Yom Kippur. And the people, I mean, this right extreme person was not able to enter the synagogue. So he got on the street and was killing 2 other people. Then we had a whole discussion on NSU. I don't know if you know about NSU, the National Socialist Underground. They were operating like 10 years ago, but now there was a second version coming up in the public debate. And this all was leading to a moment, and also migrant, and this is like what I wanted to show in that slide, that the migrant organization were pushing the government, you have to do something against racist violence. So in the middle, you see it's the announcement of the German government. We are putting up the cabinet committee. We're bringing all our ministries together, and we will make up our mind what we're going to do. And actually next week, we are expecting the measures against racism. It's a bit of blurry how much money. It's around that there are 100 million euros spent on the fight against right extremism and racism. We're not sure yet how much is going into right extremism or going into both fields, but it was in particular the migrant self-organization who were making sure that it's not just a fight against right extremism, it's also a fight against racism. Then on the right left, you see the public announcement of an umbrella organization of migrant organization that next to the cabinet committee, they're putting up a monitoring committee. So they were bringing experts together to monitor what the government is coming up, what are their ideas, what is there, and then they were publicly commenting on the progress on what's going on. And on the left side, it's the initiative of the 19th February in Hanau to also to empower the families and be there after the murder of 9 people in Hanau. I don't know if I have another slide. Yeah, I think that's my last slide to show how the demonstration and how that many people in the street also affected the public debate. This is one of the major debates we have on every Sunday. It's a so-called Presseclub. And actually, you don't have migrant people or people of color in these rounds sitting together. But this was the very first time I was seeing it, I was really like, oh, finally, we see these people, also these long-standing activists like Hadija Haruna Ölker, who is on one hand a journalist, but also a long-standing member of Black organizing. She was on air. Also Hasnain Kazim, who is writing also on topics on racism, and then two other people, white journalists from major outlets. And the topic was on racism in Germany. And large parts on that discussion were not just whether it's an individual problem or it's just a stereotyping. It was much more about police violence and whether we have to address racist police violence in Germany. And actually there is discussion about to have a study on police violence in Germany, and it's the Ministry of Interior who's opposing the whole idea and is trying to shift it to a study how police people are threatening by violence and turning the whole argument around who's actually the victim. So it's all in the air. It's very dense because many discussions are coming together. Also the discussion on facing its post-colonial legacies in Germany. That actually is an argument, I would say, that since '89, we see a normalization of colonialism, colonial history. Like Germany invented a lot into the building of the Humboldt Forum. There's a huge debate on the Humboldt Forum and displaying the ethnological collection, which is offering a momentum of identity for right extreme and new right movements and giving them a representation. So we have a discussion saying, oh, now we have a debate on post-colonial legacies because we built up this castle, which is actually a Prussian castle, which they are rebuilding. But I would say because you rebuild a Prussian castle, you don't have to be surprised that you have a right-wing populist movement on the street. And I see in different urban development plans that in particular the narrative of the colonialism and global entanglement is coming into Hamburg. I could have seen in Lisbon and Sevilla in the 90s. And I think that's very interesting that with '89, I would see there is a different development towards colonialism and also to racism. And that's why we're here now discussing it somehow again. So thank you. I'm looking at my timer and I'm perfectly. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Noa. And indeed, there is so much going on now with violence within the actual security forces, the right-wing racism within the security forces. This continues to be really frightening because they have common cause with the extreme right violence groups, these underground Nazi groups. So it's been very dangerous. And we also see it in the United States, sometimes in the security forces. We're seeing that some of the police officers that committed murders against young Black people have also have ties to these, these white supremacist groups, we call them. Yeah. So we have now the presentation by Sarah Mazuz. So we'll hear about France. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. And in the meantime, I would like also to thank you, Hillary, for the invitation. And thanks also to Matthew for his technical help during the whole preparation. Do you see my
it's good.
My PowerPoint?
I see it. Just need to launch it.
Okay, perfect. So I have now to put it this way, I think. Sorry for. All right. So, Paris, Place de la République. Paris, Place de la République, June the 13th, 2020. Thousands of protesters are gathered in support of Adama Traoré's family and the mobilization against police brutality led by the Comité Vérité et Justice pour Adama, Truth and Justice for Adama. Adama Traoré's sister, who leads the advocacy group demanding justice. Do you see the photographs on the post? Oh, I don't know what's happening. Sorry. I'm sorry. And this way, this time. Sorry for the technical problem. Yeah, that's it. You see now photos. So Adama Traoré's sister, Assa, who leads the advocacy group demanding justice for her brother and for other Black and Arab men victims of discriminatory police violence, galvanizes the crowd. Quote, today's rally is to denounce the denial of justice. Today's rally is to denounce police brutality. Today's rally is to denounce social violence. Today's rally is to denounce racial violence. There was the death of George Floyd. His death directly echoed my younger brother's death in France. And I would like to say that exactly the same thing happens in France as in the US. Our brothers are dying. And those who are killed by the police are mostly non-white individuals, mostly Blacks, mostly Arabs, non-white people who die, end quote. She then adds, quote, no matter where you come from, no matter who you are, no matter your religion, no matter your gender and sexuality, this is your fight. No one can be a bystander to anyone's death. No one can be a bystander to racial and social violence against anyone. Following George Floyd's death in Minneapolis and the BLM protest, Traoré family and other French activists have all the more intensely campaigned against police violence toward persons of minority origin. In the context of global outrage after the death of George Floyd, the Comité Adama gained renewed attention and managed to mobilize thousands in France. However, despite the comparison of the killing of George Floyd in the US with the death of Adama Traoré, who suffocated while he was pinned down by gendarmes after his arrest in July 2016, Macron's government spokesperson and other officials rejected the idea that both deaths were similar, saying that the situation is not comparable between the two countries and refusing to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism within the police and more broadly within French society. Once again, it was on several occasions said that France was not a racist country and that talking about race was irrelevant in the French Republican context because the French Republic colorblindness is deemed to cancel the social effect of race and to ensure a non-racist society. So in today's presentation, I would like to address the discrepancy between the way in which the claim made by the Comité Adama is accepted by a large part of French society and the persistent denial of systemic racism and the legacies of slavery and colonialism by French colorblind officials. In so doing, I shall draw the comparison between the Comité Adama and the BLM movement. But first of all, I would like to recall some elements about racial discrimination and racism in France. Because of the experience of African Americans who expatriated to France in early 20th century and faced less racial discrimination than in the US, there might be a persistent idea of a colorblind France offering more social opportunities to Black people and more broadly to individuals from racial minority background. However, as Alan Governor documentary movie The Myth of Colorblind suggests, France is less colorblind when it comes to Black people with heritage in former French colonies and across Africa and the Caribbean. In his seminal work, La Condition Noire, historian Pep Ndiaye revealed how Black people from sub-Saharan Africa, as well as from French overseas departments, were discriminated against in France, and how the fact of being categorized as Black hampered them in terms of academic career, employment and salary, and housing. He also emphasizes how the lived experience of racism weaved into patterns of everyday life. In 2009, sociologists Fabien Jobard and René Lévy published a report entitled Police et minorités visibles, drawing from a statistical survey led in 5 central stations in the Paris subway, where there is a high level of police activity. The report confirmed that identity checks by police officers are based primarily on racial profiling. Depending on the subway station, Blacks were between 3.3 to 11.5 times more likely than whites to be controlled, and Arabs between 1.8 to 14.8 times more likely to be controlled by the police than whites. In 2011, anthropologist Didier Fassin publishes La Force de l'Ordre, and drawing from an ethnographic study carried out over 15 months at the time of the 2005 riots, Fassin shared the life of a police station and cruised with patrols. He describes the invisible manifestation of violence and unrecognized forms of racial discrimination against minority youngsters, undocumented immigrants, and Roma people. So I now come to the second part of my presentation. Sociologist Anthony Preniolato recalls that there has been a long history of political activism against police violence and racism towards immigrants and their offspring since the 70s. In the 80s, a new generation of activists denouncing police racist crimes and police brutality under the guise of ensuring public safety emerged, notably during the 1983 March for Equality and Against Racism. In the 90s, these mobilizations became more highly publicized and politicized. In his article, Preniolato points out 5 kinds of advocacy group structuring what he called the space of mobilizations against violence and racism. So I have just summed up everything here. Created in 2016, the Comité Adama articulates indeed 3 of these 5 types. It was created by Adama Traoré's family. It is a community organizing group. Assa Traoré and other leaders of the group, such as Youssef Brakni, highlight the historical continuity that exists between the violence perpetrated by the French police against colonial subjects in the past and that perpetrated today against the descendants of post-colonial immigrants in the same way as BLM denounced the new Jim Crow. Similarly to BLM, the Comité Adama systematically recalls the way in which Black and Arab persons are killed and denounces techniques used by the police, such as chokehold position or kneeling on the victim's neck. The advocacy group also promotes intersectional equality, as you could hear that in the extract I read at the beginning of my presentation. It was also the case when the Yellow Vest movement started at the end of 2018. The Comité Adama stood in solidarity with this movement. Furthermore, the march of the 18th of July 2020, celebrating the 4th anniversary of Adama Traoré's death, was organized along with climate activists. The slogan of the march was Adama Generation and Climate Generation, we want to breathe, and thus played on the double reference to George Floyd's last words and to the climate crisis. So not only the Comité Adama is similar to BLM, but it also directly links its action in France to the action led by Black Lives Matter in the US in order to bring to light institutional racism and structural police violence in France. The discourses given by Assa Traoré or other activists of the Comité explicitly link their action to Black Lives Matter. The slogan Black Lives Matter is also often chanted in chorus during rallies or demonstrations led by the committee, and it is usual to even see BLM written down on signs raised during these events, such as here. The link and comparison between both situations in France and in the US has been epitomized by artist G.R., who realized in June 2020 a mural on the walls of a building in the 10th arrondissement in Paris. And you can see that on this mural, you've got two eyes. One is Adama Traoré's face, and the other part is representing George Floyd's face. So now the last part of my presentation. As I highlighted in my last book, Race, in this context, it was striking to see during June and July 2020 how press articles and op-ed dealt with the issue of race, racism, and racial discrimination in France. For instance, in June, two national daily newspapers, Libération and Le Monde, devoted pages to the explanation of terms used by anti-racist activists and critical race theories such as intersectionality, white privilege, race, or systemic racism. Also in June, Jean-Marc Ayrault, previous prime minister under the presidency of François Hollande and now president of the Foundation for the Memory of Slavery, published an op-ed in Le Monde for the renaming of a room in the National Assembly and a building of the Ministry of Economy bearing the name of Louis XIV minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who supervised the writing of the Code Noir, the text legalizing slavery and giving legal frame to triangular trade. Other organizations, such as the Conseil représentatif des associations noires, which advocated since 2017 for the renaming of schools and streets bearing the name of Colbert, or the Brigade Anti-Négrophobie, called for the unbolting of the statue of Colbert in the National Assembly. This statue, as well as the statue of Louis Faidherbe, who was among his various functions colonial governor of Senegal, where he quelled several rebellions, were tagged. Here you've got the one of Faidherbe. All these elements show how the debate about race and racism, the legacy of slavery and colonialism, and the recognition of minority groups socially expanded. It also highlights that these issues are now socially acknowledged beyond activism or academic debate. In contrast, on the side of the political leaders, we can only note the denial of these issues. The President of the Republic would not have had a single word for George Floyd, and he will not have even pronounced the name of Adama Traoré once publicly during the month of June. He and Christophe Castaner, then Minister of the Interior, refused to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism. Similarly, the expression police violence was dismissed. When political leaders speak out on the subject, it is systematically to give voice to their hostility to anti-racism. In his speech on the 14th of June 2020, the head of state thus affirmed that anti-racism was an unacceptable struggle when it is taken over by the separatists. A few days earlier, Le Monde relayed remarks made in private in which Emmanuel Macron castigated intersectionality and, I quote, resized discourse, adding, I quote, the academic world was guilty. He encouraged the ethnization of social question, thinking that it was a good vein, but the outlet can only be secessionist. It has the result of breaking the republic in two. End quote. In his first television interview in July 2020, the new Prime Minister, Jean Castex, recalled for his part, I quote, my values are laïcité. I cannot admit certain behaviors, certain deviances, certain inward-looking attitudes, certain communitarianism. Such speeches echo those made by academics who are more ready to denounce anti-racism than to be moved by racist crimes. For example, they were able to express themselves in the op-ed against post-colonial huckster led by Laurent Bouvet, co-founder of the Printemps Républicain, and Pierre-André Taguieff. To conclude, and as I did in my previous book, La République et ses autres, I would like to address the relation between this denial and Republican abstract universalism. Abstract universalism assumes that the demand for colorblindness is already realized in society. Those who think of themselves as universalists in these terms then believe that they perfectly embody the norm of abstract universality. They don't even realize that themselves actually have socially and historically situated position that would be easy to particularize. Nevertheless, it is precisely because they think of themselves as being on the side of the universal that they think they have the right to particularize those who seem racially different to them by ascribing them racially. And this is why abstract universalism produced a hegemonic position. In the case of race, abstract universalism also produces the condition of both the denial of how race socially interplays and the belief for members of the majority group that they have gone beyond the question, that they are universal and can thus say who is not yet universal. This is why abstract universalism produces the paradoxical situation where racializing discourse and hegemonic attitudes are expressed without hindrance, while discourse highlighting the mechanisms of racialization at work in society are constantly labeled as racist. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well. Perfect timing. I appreciate it. And now we have what in American baseball we call the cleanup hitter, the fourth batter in baseball, Ojiaku Nwabuzo. Will talk about Europe in general, please. Ojiaku.
Okay, I will give it a go. It's always difficult to be the last one, the last batter. But yeah, I think I hope it will be helpful to the discussion to kind of present a very particular perspective, which is from my organization. And basically, INA is an anti-racist European network. So I'm based in Brussels, and we have many organizations across Europe, some of which have already been mentioned today, some in Germany and in France as well. So yeah, so this is the kind of perspective that I would like to bring to the discussion. And also firstly to say, like, I'm somebody who's working in anti-racism for some years, and the Black Lives Matter protests and uprising was really so critical in moving the race equality discussion along in 2020. Now, of course, we know that Black Lives Matters was a movement that didn't just start in 2020, but for us as an organization, a European organization, mostly doing advocacy work towards the EU institutions, this movement was so critical for some of the developments that I'll talk about a little bit later on. And as previous speakers have mentioned, the protests appear to be one of the largest, or the uprisings, we should call them, I should call them, appear to be one of the largest in the US, I think in the UK as well, and I would estimate across Europe. And so these were really so significant. And I think really I can say confidently from a European perspective, we were saying that racism is a problem here too. And I think just to focus and give a little bit of context on in terms of the racism and discrimination that Black Europeans face, we have some data. We have some data. There are some surveys that are done. There's the Fundamental Rights Agency that periodically will do a survey to just test and ask people living in Europe their experiences of racism and discrimination. And in 2018, they had a survey that was published, which just focused on Black Europeans. And they were asked, you know, in the last 5 years before the survey, what their experiences were. And so Black Europeans said, at least 39% of them said that they face widespread entrenched racism and exclusion. Nearly 1/3 of them said that they face racial discrimination and harassment, and that this is commonplace. Many Black Europeans experience racist violence, and that there is discriminatory profiling by the police. This is a common reality for 1 in 4 of the respondents to the survey. And more generally, 25% of the respondents said that they face multifaceted hurdles when it comes to looking for jobs, housing, etc. So this is just for Black people across Europe. That's kind of a picture of the state of racism for Black Europeans. But in each country, of course, you will see different racialized groups, different demographics, and also a different history. So racism and discrimination looks very different, as our 3 previous speakers talked about the difference in each nation state. We see that across Europe. We don't always have the statistics available when we try and explain the type of racism that different groups are facing. But it's commonplace. It can be individual. It can be in the form, when I say individual, I mean in the form of some sort of like hate crime or discrimination in employment. It can be within the institutions, mostly in places like the police or education. And of course, there are structural forms and systemic forms of racism across Europe too. I would like to talk about the COVID and the pandemic, because I think that's really fitting for our discussion. And in terms of our perspective, we really saw at the beginning of the year the change in, or you could say the rise of racially profiling by the police, and it's directly related to the COVID and the pandemic, since there were specific confinement enforcement legislation that gave the police extra powers. And many of our members who we are in contact with were telling us that the police were stopping and searching groups more often, individuals, vehicles. This was leading to arrests and more fines. And so very early on, this was what we were being told about. And for example, for Roma communities, this was particularly problematic in terms of many settlements in Eastern Europe, especially in Bulgaria and Romania. We were getting reports of the way in which the police were treating Roma communities and settlements, which I would say was bordering on state oppression and state violence. In France, Belgium, and in the UK, we had reports very early on, which is unusual, but we had reports of a disproportionate numbers of checks and fines in working class neighborhoods. Often we don't have so much data and information from France and Belgium, UK always. But France and Belgium, it's unusual, but we were getting these reports that there were more fines and checks in working class neighborhoods, and which of course have high numbers of racialized and ethnic minority residents. So this is what we were hearing right at the start of the year, right at the start of the pandemic. And also that these powers that the law enforcement were given were so, in a way, ambiguous. The police didn't always know what kind of powers how to use their new powers. And citizens didn't know how to question their authority. You know, argue that they had a right to be out in public, for example. So we saw a lot of abuses. Some perhaps were unconscious. Some were clearly targeting certain communities and certain groups. I mean, essentially we saw more powers given to the police than most of us have seen in our lifetime during this period. So this is the context before the Black Lives Matter uprising. And for us as an organization, we were thinking, okay, we want to issue a press release. We want to talk about this. We want to raise awareness of this problem during this confinement period. And we were just waiting to issue a press release. And there was a notable death, in fact, 2 notable deaths following interaction with the police, one in France and one in Brussels. And we were like, okay, well, we need to issue a press release. And that week, we saw the killing of George Floyd. So from our perspective, we were already going to be talking about police brutality in Europe. And then we released a press release saying that this is a problem. This is a problem not just in the US, but also in Europe too. And as has been mentioned earlier on, we saw a lot of denials from European leaders saying that, you know, what happened in America, the murder of George Floyd would not have happened in Europe. Yet weeks earlier, we had seen individuals, racialized individuals die after being in contact with the police. So we were kind of shocked that this was shocked in some respects, but in other respects, it's not surprising because the concept of Europe being post-race is quite strong. But okay, this is the situation that we were in. And I would quickly like to say that there are a lot of similarities with racialized police violence in Europe with the US. So you can see, although we don't know how many people died at the hands of the police in Europe, and I don't know if there are actual national figures in the US, but maybe you can tell me otherwise. But there are similar trends in terms of how police violence impacts racialized groups. And we mustn't forget that it affects women of color. It's an intersectional problem. We really struggle to find information on women of color, but it does exist. It's also, we have to remember that transgender people will also be affected by police brutality. Mental health plays a role. In the UK, where we have more data, we can see that a significant proportion of deaths in custody are related to people who have been detained under the Mental Health Act in the UK. This is where the UK is useful in terms of collecting the data. We can also see, again in the UK, where excessive force can lead to the death of individuals in contact with the police. I mean, France has also been very criticised for their different forms of restraint that has led to deaths. And this lack of accountability, I think, is also a trend that's similar in the US and across Europe. So there is data that there's racial profiling, that there's deaths in custody. All of this evidence exists. It might be patchy, but it exists. And yet police officers, law enforcement officers are rarely held to account. And so the institutional forms of racism it remains rampant because police officers are very rarely fired or suspended without pay, etc. So these are some of the similarities, I would say, with Europe and the US. And another last similarity, which I think is something that we will work on more and more in the coming years, is technology and policing. We are seeing an increased use of technologies to assist policing and law enforcement practices. Now, many of these technologies are not new, but there is this trend to have more data sharing, more the use of analytics and predictive policing tools. And I think this will have, I mean, the evidence that we have so far is that it has implications for racialized groups. And I think as a region, Europe, and we are now entering into many conversations about counterterrorism measures, but there is an overlap here between how Europe nationally and at a European level deals with creates counterterrorism measures that's very much related to technologies. So there's this idea in Europe to basically create more and more data and opportunities for sharing data so that they can monitor activity, we'll put it like that, as much as possible. And I think the problem with that is kind of like twofold. It's the lack of transparency, which is obviously related to counterterrorism measures. It's often done secretly. And there's this justification that's about national safety and protection. And there's very limited kind of safeguards and regulations in place for this. And I find it, it's interesting that this use of data is so prevalent, and European member states want to use this kind of technologies, and yet they are still mostly reluctant to collect equality data or data on demographics where we can monitor race equality. So there's this kind of, I don't know, hypocrisy in the policy somehow. But the data that we have, the information that we have, shows that there is real potential for misuse and for targeting certain localities, certain racialized groups. And so this is a real problem, and it will continue to be a problem. So essentially, this is a really quick overview of some of the context. And to conclude, I want to talk a little bit about, as I said, I talked about Black Lives Matter and how this was really pivotal in 2020 to progressing some of our demands regarding race equality. And I mean, obviously we saw with so many protests, it was hard to ignore. The media was covering it. Corporations were responding to it, and policymakers at a European level started to respond to these issues. So after the initial denials, then we very quickly saw a kind of response from the European Parliament. Initially, there was this George Floyd resolution, which was very interesting and in a way included many policies and measures that would be useful for race equality. It's interesting that it's called the George Floyd resolution. It has a longer title. But this is the context, because initially, I think in the European Parliament, after the murder of George Floyd, it was like there was a call to denounce what had happened in the US. And then I think many of us were saying, well, this of course happens in Europe. So in the end, it was called the George Floyd resolution, and it was passed in the European Parliament. And then shortly after, we had the Action Plan Against Racism. And this was launched in September of this year. And some of the things that are really important to mention that are part of this plan. And I would like to emphasize that it's still a plan. So we're not quite yet into implementation phase, but some positive departures is that it recognizes structural racism. And in terms of European policy and non-discrimination legislation, this is relatively new. Before we were focusing, or European Commission, European institutions were focusing on this kind of like individual forms of racism, hate crimes and violence and discrimination. But in this plan, we have the concept of structural racism. And I think it's a striking development, although the way in which they formulate their understanding of structural racism could be improved. There is another potential new legislation. It's just discussed in this plan, for law enforcement, which would actually be huge, because up until this point, the European Union has decided to allow member states, or the member states remain the ones who lead on their own law enforcement and manage their own law enforcement within their countries. So if there's new legislation at an EU level, it provides us with a tool, another tool to hold member states to account regarding law enforcement. And there are other very interesting measures in this action plan. And I think generally it's one of the first times that you see an action plan against racism that covers all racialized groups. Often previous to that, we would have measures that look at Roma, or as I mentioned earlier on, reports that look at Black people in particular. This is the first time that we had a policy tool that covers all racialized groups. So we are, as I said, this is just a plan, and our organization is really trying to, as much as possible, turn this plan into the implementation phase with some clear targets. And as I said, I think there's a lot of positive things in there. But if I was to be slightly critical, it was done very rushed. It was very rushed. There are a lot of things in there that we would demand and ask for, but it's slightly anachronistic in that I would like to see at this point, after the uprising that was so significant, more transformative policies, especially regarding policing. We know that legislation from a European level is useful, but that kind of protection is not enough in terms of holding people to account, etc. So where the action plan talks about training for police, concepts of fair policing, it still talks about legalized forms of profiling. It doesn't go far enough in terms of responding to the actions and demands from Black Lives Matter. I think we could still go further. And I think also as well, when I'm talking about transformative policies, especially in light of COVID, we could have a more kind of public health approach to looking at crime, a better understanding of public safety. And I think to some extent, in all fairness, some of these kind of conversations need to happen at a local and national level. So the EU is useful to some extent, putting out some standards, guidance, legislation to protect, but we need to go further at a local and national level if we really are to address some of the problems that we have all talked about regarding policing. So I'm sorry, I will stop now. I really am at the end. Just to say that we will continue to hold governments to account.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to have to cut you all off because everyone has so much to say, and it's all so interesting. And each of you have added so much to the discussion that it becomes cumulative, that we're learning so much from one another. So at the moment, it's 10:30. So I want to tell our listeners or our participants that we're now going to move into a discussion mode. And so we want to thank you. If you need to leave, we understand, but we're going to, I think that all the speakers are able to stay a bit longer so that we can have our roundtable discussion. So let me first just open it up to ask for reactions from one another to what you've heard. I think maybe we should just do it in a free-floating way. So just whoever of the speakers, if we unmute everybody of the speakers, Matt, to let people just jump in and respond to one another. We could just go in turn if you like. Sinan, you want to say a few things perhaps about police accountability that was just raised by Ojiaku? How to hold the police accountable for abuses.
Yeah, sure. Well, maybe to say something also on the position of the Dutch police is that in 2011 it was still a full denial. Then Amnesty, I mean, my research came out, and Amnesty International, the Netherlands, pushed for acknowledging that there was institutional racism. Then the police said, yes, racism occurs, but it's on the level of incidents. But now it's and again, the last summer played a big role on in this as well. There's more and more discussion on structural racism, also among the Dutch police. Yeah, I recognize a lot in what Ojiaku has said, that legislation is only a part of the solution, and I'm always surprised by reactions from very high police chiefs that say, "But what do you mean racism? We have the Constitution. Racism is forbidden." Right? Yeah, apparently because there's legislation, there is no racism. That seems to be that seems to be the logic. So this is the type of conversations that I'm still having with very high police chiefs. No, there has been also following, recommendations by Open Justice Initiative on first in the Netherlands collecting data. So the Dutch police has no data on everyday police stops and searches. So this is also limiting, our case to argue that ethnic Is everything okay?
Yeah, Noah is making some because she's unmuted. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was I saying?
Take them to account because you have no data on stops.
Yeah, so it's. I mean, there is qualitative research in the Netherlands. Ethnographic research. We have quantitative research on self-reporting. But since the police doesn't want to collect and gather the data, it's difficult to make the case quantitatively regarding disproportionality vis-a-vis ethnic racialized groups. And the argument of the Dutch police is that they don't want to do it because it's another administrative extra administrative move for police officers. These are not very convincing arguments. These are easily can be easily solved because of apps, and this can be collected in a rather easy way. But it's blocking there. There are a lot of initiatives in terms of training, but I'm quite hesitant when it comes to training because when these initiatives are not connected to daily practices, we know from the literature that they are not effective. So there have to be more, more and more disruptions, I would say, of everyday policing. For instance, the Dutch National Police is developing a normative framework to think about good policing. I think Ojiaku also mentioned this. So, what is a good police stop? And another, I think, a mechanism to improve accountability the moment data is collected, to also give individualized feedback to police officers, because you can, for instance, look where there are more cases of disproportionate policing in particular regions, particular police stations, and even on the individual level, if there are, certain officers or groups of officers that are engaged more in racialized policing, you can be more specific, more concrete with feedback. So yeah, these are some of the recommendations, but the police is now investing particularly on training, and this is very, very limited so far.
Yeah.
And I also recognize definitely, algorithmic profiling, algorithmic governance, and there has been a recent report by again the Netherlands office of Amnesty International, where they are warning. We already have clear-cut cases in the Netherlands where some of the risk variables are racialized and ethnicized. There's a project in the city of Roermond, which is particularly targeting vehicles with a Polish and Romanian license plate. So these are seen as risky categories, and this is all, based on smart cameras that are basically doing the decision making. So, and these are interesting developments because in a way we are these institutions are transferring responsibility and accountability to these technologies and also decision making.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really scary. Big Brother is here. In the United States, we talk about defunding the police because we're trying to move the financial resources from these kinds of surveillance activities to more mental health, social service interventions, so that we don't criminalize a lot of activities of this nature. Noah, you want to respond to something you've heard from the others? Sorry, we can skip over you.
No, I was just also thinking about the presentations and also how strong it became, this the European denial, and to discuss Black Lives Matter in Europe is changing the discussion on racism, but it's also very hard to address it within institutions, and that's what I'm saying about how much it is to connect it upon the European understanding. It was also addressed universalism, but I think also the understanding of being enlightened and then being an enlightened continent, and the history of enlightenment is informing us as just not being racist. And so it's really hard to tackle the states that there is something wrong and that this accountability needs to be addressed. And Sinan was talking about that one routine to reject is to think of another measure as being too bureaucratic. When the anti-discrimination laws were introduced in Germany, and Germany was one of the last European countries to go and sign the anti-discrimination laws and put it into place. And there was a strong argument, but it's too bureaucratic and so on. And now by the years, we can see that this kind of anti-discrimination laws is actually empowering minority populations or migrant populations, Black communities, to go into counseling against discrimination, and also establishing new systems of monitoring. So this is also very interesting what Ojiako said in terms of what is happening on the EU level, how that could also empower on the local and national levels to put that into place and hold governments into account. So this short.
No, that's fine. How about you, Sarah? Do you have reactions?
Yeah, maybe I would like to react also about the idea of denial and the way in which it articulates with the absence of two things, statistics about racial discrimination and racism in different European countries, and the fact that we don't use the concept of race as a tool to analyze what is happening within European society because of this conception that European societies are already like non-racist societies. So we don't need anymore the concept of race, and the concept of race is only like the concept of the racist and not the critical tool that can be used. And the other problem, yes, is this absence of statistics, because if we had numbers, it would be much harder to deny the reality of racial discrimination in the relation with the police, but also in employment, academic trajectories, housing, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I think there are many elements producing this kind of global or general denial of the racial issue in Europe and continental Europe.
Yeah. Jaku, last before we take some questions from the audience. Oh.
I don't know. I had a really complicated question, so I probably shouldn't ask it. But maybe I should ask it, and then people can answer it.
Yes.
And as they wish. But no, I also was really interested to hear from all of you, because you have so much knowledge about your own member states. And if you had more, one of the things that's interesting for me is that I'm part of this European network, and Black Lives Matter is something that is, to what extent does it bring in other racialized groups into this? And I wondered if there was something that you could tell me about what's happening at a national level, to see if how relevant it is to all potential groups that face violence, police violence. But
do you mean
yes.
beyond Black, beyond
yeah.
we would call Black, but you would include, for example, the Roma and the Poles and the people, the Islamophobic behaviors and the like? One of the things I find very interesting is that in the United States, the idea of Islamic terrorism is often separated as a problem of immigration and so on, rather than a problem of race relations. These are spheres that are very often discussed separately, and the groups do not necessarily cooperate. But I'm hearing in Europe that there is a kind of global ignoring of all of these groups, that it's not just people of color, but that it's also nationality and the like. I hear nobody.
May I say something?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Maybe there are two things. I'm talking about the case of France, and it's very hard in the case of France to make, official recognize racial discrimination, but also that Islamophobia exists, and that it is not only a religious discrimination, but it has a racial aspect, and that Muslims are not only discriminated as a religion, but because they are racialized as Muslim, and it goes beyond the issue of access to mosques, etc. But it is just because the way in which they are thought as the radical other. And and especially now with the context of terrorist attack, and all the more now in France with the way in which laïcité is weaponized by the political leaders, and at the same time, it's very hard to just say there are different things.
there is Islamophobia. For example, in France, there is even a debate about the word Islamophobia. You cannot use it because it's supposed to be like something from the activist, which is not true, and that is just deforming the social reality. So there's this aspect. And at the same time, there's also, I mean, to talk about the articulation between immigration and racial issues, in the case of France, it's very easy also to avoid the issue of race by talking about immigration and saying there are immigrants, there are foreigners, and using this kind of categories to talk about groups which are not foreigners anymore, which are not immigrants, but they are like racialized groups. But instead of talking about race, we still talk in terms of immigration, integration, and etc. So, yeah.
Yeah, Sinan. Sinan, you want to speak?
Yes. Yeah, I just wanted to respond again, maybe to the because it hasn't been mentioned yet, but but I think it's there, right? Racism on the European continent also obviously connects back to the Second World War and the genocide, of the Holocaust, and in the Netherlands. And I just wanted to connect this part to what we were discussing earlier on ethnic data collection. So in the Netherlands, one of the big major sensitivities regarding ethnic statistical data collection is related to the period of the Second World War, because the Netherlands, in fact, they had a very comprehensive registration system in place. And this, in fact, led to these bureaucratic categories. They made it possible that a lot of Dutch Jews, in fact, were transported to the camps, and it was this this mechanism, this administrative mechanism that was already in place that made this possible. And in the conversations on ethnic data collection, this also keeps coming back. The reference to the Second World War and the Holocaust. And it's one of the sensitivities. And the Dutch police also played, of course, an important role in gathering and rounding up Jews to be transported. So there is, and I think, I mean, this is obviously more than just a comfortable way to insert this history. This is a serious sensitivity in the Dutch context.
Yeah. Anyone else? Oh, yeah. Oh, Noah? Yeah. Noah, then Ojak.
Yeah, what Sinan was saying, this is also very crucial in Germany. Actually, when I was referring to the UN report, kind of the argument is saying, we did that. We did collected data and it went wrong. And therefore there is this denial to think through what it would mean to think through collecting ethnic data. And I'm astonished why they don't come up with the question that it's not about ethnic data, it's about equality data. And that's a total different approach to collect data. But there is a huge reluctance to collect this kind of data, because it's also what we have discussed before, the denial of race, that this category is playing out and is crucial to European societies. And what I think is so interesting for looking at the German context, on one hand we have the history of National Socialism, and now Germany is realizing, oops, we had a colonial history. Germany was so busy with its history of National Socialism, of being a state of perpetrators, of having killed millions of people. And now as time is going and newer generations are coming up and saying, but look, the ongoing racism is still real, and there's a connection from colonialism and National Socialism. It was for many years that connection never was allowed to do, and now we're talking about the genocide of Herero and Nama and now Namibia, and how that connections are made through German history. This is one thing, but on the other hand, we see a discussion about the impact of post-colonial studies. If you look at the recent discussion we had around Achille Mbembe, he wanted to give a talk, and then he was disinvited because he was understood as an anti-Semite. And we had a huge discussion in the feuilleton how anti-Semitism and post-colonial approaches do come together or are against each other, and it's very interesting. I don't know if you can transport it to other European contexts. I think it's very specific to Germany. And one last point, what I also said, and Sinan was also referring to it a bit, that on one hand, racism is connected to the history of history, as how migrant people are racialized as other, and to not really understand racism as a process, how people are racialized, but thinking it more from a very race-based concept, from an identity concept. And so it's so hard to go through, and that what's new is now we have anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Muslim racism. And so it seems to be very complicated how these are entangled, and also our histories of, on one hand, of divide and rule, and that you have a hierarchy within the victims. And that on the ground in anti-racist coalition building is often very hard to tackle, how that is possible to come to terms in solidarity. So I think what the problem in Germany is that after 45, we in Germany thought, okay, we did it once wrong and racism is over. And we were just denying it, but there was no education in what racism is about. There was no theorizing about it. And so it was happening on the ground, and the communities were coming up with theories, and there's a lot of learning of the US, but translating these concepts to the European context, that I think is a huge task, and where I think also universities and education systems need to come up and educate how these concepts are translating, are shifting, transporting different histories. And this is I think is one of the major and urgent tasks to be done.
This is really important, how racism is produced as a process, because if we don't see it coming, it gets out of hand. Certainly we have this problem now in the US, and hopefully our president will leave. Before we take a question now, Ojiaku, you will be the last. Yeah, we'll take some questions after you.
I just really wanted to very quickly to kind of say something after Sinan said, was talking about collecting data. And I don't know if it's just because I'm from the UK and we do this. And so it feels to me, from my perspective, that there is a real kind of block at a national level to do this data collection, which is really hugely important if we really want to address and look at race equality and to do the holding to account. And it's not, I know, I understand, and I hear it because I work in a European environment, that there is this history. But I don't understand, because I'm from the UK, like how we can ever get past this. And it's at a European level, there is a lot of guidance to kind of say how to do equality data collection. It's done in the UK, but there's just this block at a national level, and it's really frustrating, as well as somebody who's looking at data a lot. And I think that it's also not true that member states don't collect data. They collect some data. So they'll collect data on nationality, migration background. And this is what's really interesting. So in Belgium, from my understanding, certain groups with a migration background, there is data collected on those groups. And also in the Netherlands, and Sinan, you were describing the distinction between allochthone and I can't remember the other one. These difficult Dutch words.
Allochthone, autochtone.
Yeah, and from my understanding, there is some data collected around these groups. So it's like the nation states do define some groups that they want to collect data on, and then at the same time say that they don't want to do this equality data collection, which I find incredibly frustrating. And what I notice is that there are a lot of civil society organizations, IOTO, I think in Germany, starting to do like a census. I think it's called a Black census, but maybe you can tell me. But it's like it falls again on the responsibility of the racialized group to do this kind of data collection and like hold these governments to account, which is just frustrating. I'm just venting, but.
No, that it's completely true. I mean, each country has its own justifications for what data it collects and what it doesn't. We just had our census in the US, and there were questions about whether data should be collected on undocumented immigrants, people who are not in the country illegally, and you're supposed to count them according to our Constitution. But the government tried to eliminate people who were not citizens from the count. So.
Yeah. I'd like to add to what Giaco said to the Black census. It's called the Afro census, and it's a community-based data collection. So it's not operating on a municipal or state level. It's run by the Black communities and reaching out to other Black people within Germany and to collect data on their behalf. Because as it was said, collecting equality data is very scarce, and it's very frustrating to get also on the municipal level, to get data on the municipal level or either federal and nation state. So that's one of the outcomes that now the communities themselves are start organizing to get their data.
Right.
May I add something?
Last one, yeah.
Sorry, very quickly, just about what Diego has said also. I think the debate conflates in different European countries two things: the constitution of racist files during World War II by different governments which were collaborating with the Nazi, and the production of equality, the use of race category to measure discrimination and produce equality data. And there's this kind of conflation which blocks the debate.
Yeah, exactly. So people are out there, and I want to at least give somebody an opportunity to ask a question. So I'm going to look in is there anybody out there who wants to, students or others in the audience who would like to pose a question? And I don't see the Q&A. Is there anybody who wants to pose a question from the audience? Q&A, or raise your hand, or everybody's leaving? Anybody? Well, it's already 11 o'clock, and I promised that we would finish half an hour ago. So I think if I don't receive any question from the audience, that I will ask Matt to stop recording, and I will thank everybody who's excellent panel. Thank you, Shaniqua. And I will thank all of you, really. I found it absolutely terrific. I learned a lot, and I work on this, and I can't wait to follow up on some of these issues, things that I didn't know about, and also the policy implications. It's, how do we prevent police violence? I mean, we're just starting now to think through how to to protect Black lives, if you will, from the state, in effect, whether it's surveillance in general or whether it's the actual violence that's perpetrated on people. I don't know about whether this action plan will ever get off the ground, but it seems to me that after Brexit and so on, where there is racial statistics, that on the continent, coming to terms with the past is important for us to move forward. It's clear that each nation state has its own kind of national traumas that is impeding movement towards equality, racial equality for the new generation. And one reason I'm so pleased that you participated is everybody here is young, and I'm very old. So watching the younger generation of scholars and the things, no, truly, the younger generation of scholars to see these issues are suddenly being studied, and they were not studied for a good 20 years until the new millennium. For the period that I was, your age, people did not really study race in Europe. It was kind of taboo, except in Britain. It was the only place where questions of color and racialization were examined. And now I'm seeing a coming to terms. So I laud you. I look forward to reading you in the future. And I hope one day I'll actually meet you in the flesh, personally. So, merci, dankeschön, and yeah, talk. So,
Thank you.
yeah, no, thank you so much for participating, and we'll send you the link to the recording. Okay.
Thank you so much for organizing.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for organizing and hosting.
Yes, thanks for the invitation.